So previously we created this xBird component, right? With XElement, we basically could instantiate all our XElements at the top here, right? There's a couple of ways of writing XElement, right? So we have this method here where basically we just using Pascal case, right, to just declare XElement. XElement's a polymorphic component, and by that means that there's a number of ways for you to write an XElement component in your project, and it really depends on your preference. What we've got is really using what I call implicitly naming elements, where we're just telling it, just using Pascal case capital H for the H5. This would be the equivalent would be, and this is the HTML tag, and this would be the label. Whereas if we take away the tag, XElement then deciphers whether or not it is a tag, and if it isn't a tag, then it creates its own custom component. Otherwise, it would just pick up on the HTML element and do that for you. It's quite cool. So that is how we bring XElement into the project. Otherwise, Astro will just basically create all these as static HTML elements. As you can see down here, this is just a straight up div. This is a straight up heading. And then underneath, just to give it a wee bit of space between everything, we have our HTML. This is an example of Astro being HTML first, where we declare to Astro, sorry, where XElement is HTML first, where we declare to Astro exactly the tag that it is going to be. This then gives us the ability to then add superpowers in, because what we do, we just hijack the element and put that through XElement and then into Astro. And that's what we're doing here with the button. We're literally just hijacking it with the @click event handler and applying the JavaScript, minifying it, attaching it to the page, and then sending that down. So whenever you click the fetch button request, it does the job. And as you can see, this page has just reloaded, right? Now, at the bottom, the fetch request happened. There is very little delay. There's no hydration. There's no need for it with XElement and Astro, because all this gets loaded as soon as the DOM contents gets loaded. Whereas with the hydration selectors, if we were to compare it with the sBird, this page, once it's loaded, this is static HTML that got loaded. Now the hydration kicked in at the background, and then it filled in the JavaScript, and then we're allowed to then interact with it. So there's a couple of steps happening. What XElement does is that these steps are necessary for the UI frameworks. They do come with their own renders. That does need to get sent out the wire, and then that does need to kick in onto the browser, figure out what needs to be hydrated, and then sprinkle in the JavaScript as it goes, right? Whereas with XElement, we skip a lot of that. And that is one key performance difference between XElement and other UI frameworks within Astro. Now, everybody has its own place, and XElement's trying to carve out its own at the present moment. So yes, we're making fetch requests every time we do this. Now let's bring this up and go into our network. Right, what have we got here? We've just got a couple of things that comes along. Sorry, I'll just try and make this bigger so it's easier to read. There we go. Right, so we have Git pod refreshing itself. We have the React DevTools backend, and this is the hydration script that comes along. And as you can see, there is a couple of things. It's not that heavy, which is great. We're not saying it's a lot of JavaScript. It's a very light amount, and Astro is very smart in the way that it deals with the partial hydration. Whereas with XElement, if we were to make a fetch request, it is as simple as just getting the data back. There you go. Makes a fetch request and it's done. Every time you hit the button, Sorry, I'm just going to plug this back into the side of the screen here. There's a fetch request. Again, again, and again. Depending on your network on your network speed, these fetch requests are very quick. They request a minimum amount of data. So, you know, it's like the time it takes is in the hundreds of milliseconds. And we can do that. And then what happens is XElement basically just then uses your simple DOM manipulation methods, right? Just here, right? This little bit down the bottom here, because everything above this line of literal, right, is us getting the data, filtering the data, and just doing what we need to do to have something to work with. We have we're constructing our own HTML literals, right? Nothing too difficult here. Just plugging in the bird as we send it down. This becomes the children, right? And we just send that down. And then using DOM methods such as insert adjacent HTML, we can plug that in to our list elements, right? Now these two lists, list 1 and list 2, is pretty much these two span items, once we make our way past all these buttons, right? And then we have these spans. I mean, to be honest, there is a fair bit of refactoring I would like to do on this page, but I'll do that off screen, right? But that is just to basically break out these buttons into their own individual components, right? And then just bring them in and then just map over the top of them. That's what I would do. But here we have our span IDs. Now these are just your typical HTML elements, right? And all we've done is given it an ID. IDs are global in JavaScript. So if I was to go back to our React bird and into the console here, right, we could just go list 1, right? And we have literally got our little list. Ah, damn you. Right, so before it refreshes, if you can see it in the bottom left-hand corner, it does pop up saying list 1, right? Just here, see that? Right, so we can call this. No matter what ID you set in JavaScript, it's always going to be global. That's nothing special to XElement, that's just JavaScript. And this is something that you need to understand with XElement. We leverage a lot of innate JavaScript behavior. There's nothing special over the top of it. It might feel special because we're coming back into this, but yeah, this is just a typical behavior that you're entitled to. So yes, this is how we call our lists, right? And then from there, every time we click the button, we clear the inner contents of the list so it's fresh. And then we just basically inject into it the the UL list that we created. And then with the children, we're just basically passing in the list of appending birds, and it just does that. And this here is basically us mapping over the literal, gives us an array, and then that array gets put into there. Happy days. We're also doing something at the bottom here, the title location. Again, title location is given an ID, right? So we can just grab that. And then every time we click the button, so you see the bird location is nothing, and then we hit Reykjavik, and it basically just updates the text location inside there. And that is what I really want to explore a wee bit more today, is a bit more of the XElement goodies, right? Because there's a lot of goodies. So far, I feel that this is pretty decent and standard in that respect, Sarah, right? We can do...
Yep, I mean, we'll format the bottom.
Yep.
Now, up at the top, I don't want to hijack where you think you might want to go, but
no, by all means, you tell me.
The top, the top is what I wanted to tackle next. So,
right.
Because last week we got the form up there, but I don't know if it's actually really doing anything yet. We just sort of copied it over. But yes, this notion of a default location. So my React app was actually storing two things. It was storing the code for making the current call, and it stored a default location, because presumably if you're going to check a bunch of different kinds of bird listings, what's notable, what was in the last 30 days, what's common in this area, probably you're just going to be checking for the same area over and over again. You want to see your local stuff. So I was also holding this default location. And that's what I'd like us to get now, is like, okay, let's use XElement and let's replace the React part that was setting and holding a default location to then be shared among all the components.
See, that is extremely easy, right? And I'll show that to you in a second, because XElement provides you this concept of a store, right? And we touched on this last week, and I'll retouch on this again because it is the second argument that is available to you in every single callback function, right? And it allows you to basically transcend data between different XElements. It is something that is the only one thing that connects every XElement. Every XElement is individually scoped to that element. Whereas, there's no, it's very difficult for you to break out that boundary. It is really tight. But we had to give you a safe escape hatch. And to be honest, the safest escape hatch was that we figured out was to basically do something similar to export. Sorry. Right. In effect, the store is XElement creating an empty object within the page space scope. From here, we have just an empty object, nothing special to the store. But with an empty object, and JavaScript being everything as an object, we can do stuff to that. We can add stuff to that. We could add the whole array, bunch of JavaScript primitives and, objects such as arrays and objects, functions, returns, we can do stuff. And the store is pretty much what we're going to really tackle for this first part. Like Sarah said, we're just going to take the default location, we're going to set it so whenever they hit that default location, now as you can see, when we hit that, this is not Gitpod refreshing the page, this is the actual button refreshing the page. So there's a typical behavior with this action. So we need to prevent that as well, right? Because let me just do what we did last time. Have the React code on the right hand side, Astro on the left, right? And let me get rid of this mini bar. Mini map. Toggle mini map off. There we go. Perfect. Right. Just so we could get a wee bit more space. And now, so as you can see, we have some sort of. Sarah managed to put the prevent default on the behavior on this, just to stop the page from reloading, because it's this form. This is what it does. It's a submit action, right? And there's a good way of doing that with with XElement. Because we're not going to expect you to write event prevent default all the time you wish to do this. XElement gives, does help you with that in terms of we could just specify it on the actual click handler itself. So let me just find that form, right? Default bird location, is that to here? No. Sorry, let me just go to xBird. Here we go. Button, set a default location on the form, right? So it's in this form here. And this is what we're going to be working on first of all, right? Back into the xBird folder, we're just going to create a new file saying xform, right? Because first of all we do into any XElement component, we just basically, there is something, right, that I want to do stress. You don't really need to use import XElement as we normally do, right? It's like normally we would do import XElement from Astro XElement. If I can spell today. And then what we normally do here is we'll just continue, it's like we go, and then all we're going to be doing is just going to do XElement. But that feels a wee bit verbose and a wee bit tiry. So we can change this up, And all we're doing, like I said, is that we just created an XElement form. Now, with XElement, you can create all the HTML elements. There's not one HTML element that you're unable to create. In fact, you could create your own custom HTML elements as well. So yeah, you could do this with everything in Astro. It's you're not restricted to a single component, if you get what I mean. Or there's not one that you can and cannot do. So with our form, we're just going to basically go back to the xBird page, copy this, right, and actually, we've got that set up here, right? So I'm just going to import the X form and just replace it here as well. So go X form from components back into xBird, xform.astro, right? And we're just going to, like I say, cut this out and replace this with xform. Now, that's all we're going to basically do here, right? Is just pop in the placeholder, go back to the Birdie app, right? We're not going to, it's actually not going to bring in anything, it's just an empty form, right? And all we're just going to do is just kind of quickly, drop in the form, quickly just change this to a capital, and that's it, turned into an XElement. The whole point is we only need to turn in what we want to, it's like we can turn every single one of these into, so we go up here, right? Input,
Yeah, like that
the
input or the button.
Exactly. And you know what? I'm just going to call this something else. I'm just going to go right.
Yep.
So just to differentiate, there's a couple of things going on here. We have an implicitly named element. We have an explicitly named element. Why is it explicit? Because we've given it a label. So on the left-hand side, we have the HTML tag. On the right-hand side, we've given it the label for us, the developer. Now, normally we could go with the capital B, right? Because we can differentiate between HTML and JSX, in that respects, right? But what if we just wanted to, actually give us more meaning to our element? Because this text box is not going to get shown to anyone else apart from us on this page, if you get me. This is just to give us that extra semantic meaning that could help us, in terms of like other people coming into this component and seeing it as this, oh right, it's a text box. You know what I mean? Or something like that. It just helps you in that respects. So I'm just going to actually call this text input, right? And I did F2 to get that up. So if you do F2, it renames the place for you. So that's text input, right? And we've got typical, HTML holders in here. We've got the placeholder, we've got the name. So where's this? I want to see this. I want to do this. This is cool, right? So we could go, this is quite cool.
So because the eBird API is dependent upon you submitting their location code into the API call, this was sort of my path of least resistance to, as you said, I'm in Glasgow. What's my code? So I'm like, okay, I'm going to give you this really crappy interface that makes you click 3 times, but you can find Glasgow's code. And so this is what I've done, querying another of eBird's API, which is show me what the codes are. So going backwards is not as straightforward as you would like. This is to show you that this has been my solution to the problem. I'm in Glasgow. What's my code?
To be honest, I like that. Let's keep this, right? I am determined, right? I'm going to get my country code.
I don't know why it refreshes so frequently for you and it doesn't as frequently for me.
GBCL, right? Got you. Right. Yeah.
No, but I can get. Yeah, I can go one further. When you click, if you had clicked on that, yeah, you didn't need to copy and paste. I had it so that if you had clicked on that, it would set the state for your default location.
Got you. So let's do this, right? So let's work on this and this, right? And because that's quite cool, right? So with a button, we're just basically setting. All we're going to do here is set the state, yeah.
Yep.
Right. So on submit, we're just going to basically turn this, right? This placeholder that we made last week, right? To say, yeah, just to remind us that we're going to do something here. So we're just going to turn this into an @submit like this, And I'm just going to go prevent on the side of it. And guess what? That's prevented the default behavior location. Right, so
Yep.
here, right, all I'm going to do is I'm just going to console log and go this. There we go. And straight back to xBird just to see if everything works okay, right? Because we've got a console log on this. When we hit it, we got submitted
Yep.
for. The prevent default behavior has stopped. So we're not doing anything. Did you see that? And all we did was that we just turned the submit, put an at, turned it back into lowercase, I have to say, right? And then
Yep.
just provided, you know, like you normally do, the actual the event listener, right, on the form. And here, all we're going to do is we're going to capture the console log the store, right? And just to see what's on it. So when I hit this, it's empty, right? An empty object in here, right? And then if I go to here, it's empty because these are not used in the store, right? So we need to go back to the actual X notable, as we called it, right? And just adjust this code, right, to use the location into the store, right? Now the easiest way to do this would be store.location also equals this dot dataset, right? Now, ideally, when we do this, we've clicked this. This should update the store. Damn it. Should update the store. Yes. So we've got that there.
Ah. But
Let's
now
go.
these components, these are separate components that are just both being rendered to the Astro page, and they are sharing the same store.
Yes. So if I
Okay.
hit Preact, right, because technically these are individual XElements as well,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
So these
They're their
individual,
own capital B buttons. Yeah.
exactly, capital B buttons, right? So these, every time we hit this, this is now just by simply saying store.location also equals this dataset.location, right? We could attach this information to the actual store itself, and we've given it a namespace under location. So no matter where you are in any XElement, you'll be able to access the store.location, right? And so like up here, right, is say nothing, we hit Stockholm, right? Stockholm, we hit default location, and it gives us a Stockholm location code. Reykjavik, right? And we hit set default location, gives us a Reykjavik default location. We've got our set our default location, so if we just go right, that's right, because see, we're not doing anything with this input element here. So let's just go back to the form, capture this input element. So here we go, stop, right, so in here, it is, what is it, it's dot value, isn't it? The value change for the inputs. Why are you, my lovely error boundaries. It does repeat itself. I don't know quite understand why Astro does that, but yes, we'll fix that one day. But here is because it's there's nothing present to the at value, right? So this is now at change, right? And here we're just going to basically do a console log every time there's a change, right? And what we're going to do is basically get the value, right? So we're going to do console.log, and we're going to go this dot value. Yes, I believe, right? And so, see that? So now we can do that. We could get this value, right? All we got to do is just go store.location equals this dot value, right? And then what do you call it? There's, sorry, we've not declared store in here, so we could go event, right? And then store. Sometimes what I do, if I'm not using the first one, I just throw in a little underscore as a placeholder. I don't know if you can see that there, right? Score there as a placeholder just to placehold the first slot, because I only really need the store, which is available in the second parameter position, right? And this, no matter if you're in any event handler, this will always reflects this is always the element. So this is always the element from any event listener. Normally, event listeners, this reflects the global scope. So if you did a document.add event listener in JavaScript and you put in this in there, that would reflect the entire document, right? The global scope of the document. Whereas we've tweaked it so that this actually refers to the actual element itself, which is pretty damn cool. Because the only way that you could have access to that normally, right, the element, is if you do a do method, where we're just basically doing something, and the first method is the first parameter is the actual element. Then you will have the store. This is the event. So if we went to do this, console log, right, and we're back to the bird. Sorry, yes, we get rid of this. Right, we're back to the bird page here. Go back to Glasgow, and then we've got the event that fired up. So it's not the actual element that gets returned, it's the event. But if I went back and just did console log this, right, and I went back to do Glasgow, we get the actual element. And so that's us basically done the first bit, I think. You know, whenever we change something or we've got an @submit as well, right? And here we basically go and we just placeholder in the first one, putting in the store for the second one, bum 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 bum, and we're just doing store.location equals this dot value.
Okay, so let me throw another curveball in here. So in my original app, I actually kept track of two different locations. I kept track of a default location, and then so just because it's your default location, you might also want to check other places, which is why my buttons were making specific calls to specific cities. Now, what we did last week was we refactored, when we moved it into XElement, we also refactored it so that we could just use the data location attribute that was attached to each of those XElement buttons.
Yes, that's correct.
So what we've done, though, is we've lost this sense of two different locations, of a default location, like the one that you're going to, barring anything else, just check my default, versus a separate. So yes, we're going to want, I'm assuming here, as you say, a default location for this stuff.
Not a problem. So there you go.
Yep.
Default location equals this value, right? And then what we're going to do is, so when this submits, this just stores that, right? And then we just basically console log the default location, right? Just to make sure it's there, right? And then console store dot, just to make sure it's there, right? And with here we go Glasgow, set default location is now set to Glasgow, right? But whereas if I go to Stockholm and if I hit set default location, we've got two on the object now. We've got the default location and then we've got the secondary location.
So then what we can do now, before we lose track of it, is the buttons down at the bottom, the use my location default button, we had hard coded that with my local area.
Of course, yes.
But now we're going to want to hook that up to the default location property in store.
Good shout. Let's do that right now. Here, default location, right? And all we're basically going to do, right, is change this bit because the data location, right? This is a wee bit of a JavaScript action, right? So all we're going to do is go to .do, right? Is as I said, the first one's the element, and then the second one's a store. All right. And then we basically open it up, and then we're just going to go to yes. So this dot dataset dot location is equal to store dot default location.
Perfect.
Right, and then we just get rid of that. Right.
Yep.
So if we go to Glasgow, set default location. Right. And if we hit set default location here, it's Glasgow. Right. And then if we go here, location still Glasgow, location is undefined. Ah, right, okay. So that's breaking on the fetch, right? So every time we click this is breaking on the fetch, right? So
Yeah, so that means whatever is going into location. Oh, right, because right now you've set your default location as like the city name Glasgow, but the fetch itself has to be made with a bird code. So I bet if you go back to the form and instead of Glasgow, type in an actual bird code, the Scotland one, that's fine.
Right, okay,
So
no, it's still this bit here, right? So it's like I just need to reset the default location from store.location. Why is this not kicking in? Dataset.location. I just had an interesting idea. So on submit, we're changing this, right? And what we're going to do is going to name that button, right? This one here, default button. And then what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to set the default location from the actual form, right? Because technically speaking, whenever this needs to set the default location. So whenever we hit submit, right, we basically go, sorry, let me just properly rename that button there. Default button. What am I doing clicking about the place? Default button dot dataset dot location is equal to I. Right, and then that should be right. So if I was to go back to this, set default location is this. Broke. I'm just going to check something here because I believe this can be done using the observer, the DOM Mutation Observer API, right? So I'm just going to double check something, right? That's right. So we click, check the entry, and if this should change, right? Preact it. This here, right, is the DOM Mutation Observer. So what this does is basically keeps an eye on certain elements, right? So if you apply the observe on an actual element, it would only observe that particular element. So ideally, if anything changes to its attributes, data structure, its children, etc., it will fire off a callback function, right? So we set the default data object, right? Default data location. Do that again, right? And then we do this. No, what happened to you? The problem I'm currently trying to figure out is that the do fires once, and that's upon when the DOM loads, right? It is like the one when on component mount basically, right?
so it's the update, it's the page render,
Yes.
whatever, yeah. And so
So
just updating it in the form isn't necessarily updating it available to the other components.
exactly. So what
Okay.
I was just thinking, right, was that if there was some way that I could update on submit, we update the default location value on the button, right? And then from there, it basically is like it passes down that value. So the default location is already stored, right? But there's a couple of ways to do it, and they're all a bit hacky, is what I'm just trying to think is the least hacky way of doing this. Yep, there's a prevent on this as well. Sorry, I forgot to mention. Right, so store dot the default location, so, and then we're just going to go default button dot data set. Actually, do you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to console log this. I don't think this submit's working. Console, yep, we've got a button. Spelling mistake, Sarah, that's all it was. Story goes this. Copy. That goes that. So here, right, all we're basically doing, right, is telling on whenever we click to change the actual button's default location on the dataset. Whenever we hit this button, it sets the data attribute for this, right? So we could go here, set default location, and notice that the error logs are going. So there's no birds here, is what I'm basically can assume.
Yes, because
Right.
we covered that last time, that it's possible that there's no unusual bird sightings in a particular area.
Of course.
So whenever I want to test, let's do Toronto, because there's always
Right.
stuff going on in
CA.
Toronto.
CA.
Yes, so CAON for
ON.
Ontario, TO for Toronto.
TO. Perfect, right?
Yep.
So we set the default location. We've got that going.
Okay.
Oh,
Now,
go screw.
quick,
Right, quick, right? Hit default
and press the
location.
button.
Right.
Excellent. Yes.
And that is, yeah. I kid you not.
So we are holding two different location pieces information in the store right now. We are holding a default location, and then our API fetch call is using just plain old location to make
Exactly.
whatever call. Yeah.
Exactly. And because it's like back up in here, right? So here we're just basically setting the store.location along with the dataset location. So whatever the dataset location is, right? So yeah, we're done part one, I believe. This bit here.
Yes, so I would say right now where we are is if you know a code, if you want to type in a new code, you can set your default location, and then the use my default location button works. It does make the API call with that default location as the location variable in the API URL.
Perfect. Yes, exactly.
Yep.
And
Perfect.
then yeah, and then from there, right? It's like we've got use my default bird's location. I use my default location fills up in the text. You see, so it's like if we set it up here, set default location, right? Because it's like once we set it, right, we'll go to here, and we'll fill.
Yep.
It's like that fills up saying use my default location. Well, our default location is already set up here. You get what I mean?
Yep.
Right.
Perfect.
Yeah. I mean, you could even do one further because this is just a text content update. We could even do this, it's like back in here, right? It's like this dot text content, right? Title dot location dot text content equals this dot text content and this dot text content. Right, and I'm just going to try and plug this in here. So I'm just going to say So something
Yeah.
like that, right?
Right. Yeah.
Now, if we go to there you go.
Yep. Yep. But then otherwise, if we click any of the other buttons, it's just going to show the city name.
Yep.
Yep. Perfect.
If you know JavaScript, you know XElement.